We're here today in Palestrina, this incredible ancient town, and I'm here with Adrian Hundhausen, who has written the lexicon, the Pharos. He promised just a couple months ago to tell us exactly how the ancient Greeks told time, and, well, now the time has come.
Indeed it has, and so today we're going to look at how people talked about the hours and told the time, not just in Greece, but also in Egypt, in Judea at the time of Christ, and in Asia Minor, because in the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Koine Greek was the lingua franca, so they all told the time the same way. And then we're also going to look at how the Romans told the time, and they did it in a way that was so different that when they found times in Greek texts, they completely misinterpreted them. And scholars have been copying that Roman mistake ever since. But that all ends today, because right now we're going to go up there and discover how they said the time in ancient Greek from Ptolemaic Egypt all the way to the fall of Constantinople.
Let's go. This incredible sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia was built around 200 BC, probably rebuilt by Sulla in 80 BC. And this is the place that ancient Roman families would bring their newborns in order to be blessed by the Dea Fortuna.
I mean, this is impressive. I mean, am I right in that I can see the coast from here? And so this is a massive sanctuary that would have been visible from the city of Rome, but also from the coast?
That's right, yeah. It just commands the entire valley. It makes sense that ancient peoples would have built their citadel here.
Yeah, and while we're not in the Eastern Mediterranean right now, this is a perfect place to talk about how Greeks told the time, because this entire complex was built in imitation of the massive sanctuaries that you found in the Eastern Mediterranean in places like Delphi and on Kos. And so we'll head up there now and look at the hours.
So what are we looking at here?
Okay, these are two different kinds of Roman sundials. And this one here on the right is of a kind that's a little bit rarer. And the few that have been found up near Aquileia, near Venice. And, hey, you know this. What's the name of your Roman expert on architecture?
Vitruvius.
Yeah, so Vitruvius gave a catalog with 10 kinds of sundials that were in existence when he lived in the 1st century BC. And I think this is what he would have called antiborion. What does that mean, antiborion?
Against the north.
Yeah, right. So what you did was you took this and you turned the concave part of it towards the north, and then the sun from the south entered through this little hole in the top. And then you had a little shaft of sunlight that showed you the hour. So let's see if I can get this right. In the morning, if we're in the north, the sun would be up there in the morning, and that little shaft of sunlight would show up here. And then as the sun rises in the sky towards midday, that little shaft of light would move down here. And in the afternoon, it would climb up here until sunset, when it would disappear until the next day.
All right.
So this one had to be oriented towards the north. And I think it's pretty cool that they would use the shaft of sunlight as the indicator for what time it is. Here you see the lines. What are these lines, Luke?
So, well, these would be the lines for each hour, right?
And so they just simply divided the day into 12 equal parts and marked them off here. And of course, in the winter, the sun would be up in the sky for less time. And so that little shaft of light would move around here faster.
Right.
And it would cover one of these hours in less time. And so that would have been about 45 of our modern minutes. Whereas in the summer, when the sun is up there for longer, that little shaft of sunlight moves more slowly, and it takes about 75 of our modern minutes to cover one of those hours at this latitude here near Rome.
So the hours were literally longer in summer.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I call them stretchy hours, but officially these are called seasonal hours. And that's the way you told the time in the ancient world, unless you were a doctor or an astronomer, and they had equinoctial hours. But for normal people, you told the time using these seasonal hours, which were, I mean, obviously longer in the summer and shorter in the winter.
So what we do is we pretend that it's the equinox every day.
Right.
In our modern system.
Exactly. And only at the equinox would it take 60 of our modern minutes for this little shaft of sunlight to cross one of those hours.
So how did you get into this?
Yeah, well, what happened was, about 2 years ago, I think, it came time for me to put together the final version of my chapter for the lexicon on time. And part of that was assembling the various set phrases that they used in ancient Greek, or Koine, to talk about the hours. And when I looked at those phrases, I sensed that there was either some kind of internal contradiction in the way the Greeks were using them, or maybe they were being translated wrong. It just didn't seem right. And so I took it upon myself to sort out all of these phrases. But it still took me, I think, even a year of persistent work before I really understood just how differently they told the time in Greek from the way the Romans told the time, and the way we tell the time, right? And we basically tell the time the way the Romans did. We use Roman hours.
What do you mean we use Roman hours?
Okay, well, in order to show you that, let's go over to the other sundial. Okay. Now, for Vitruvius, this would have been what's called a hemikyklion, which means half circle, and I think you can see the half circle there, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is actually the most common kind of sundial that they used in antiquity, and we've got hundreds of examples of these from all over the Mediterranean and in various museums.
So how do we actually read the time off of a sundial like this?
Okay, well, you see the same hour lines as on the other one, and what are we missing here that we would normally expect to see, for example, on a modern clock, or even on more recent sundials?
Numbers.
Yeah, and again, this is a little bit disorienting because we don't have the hours numbered on the stone, but we know how the Romans numbered these lines mentally. For example, we have this chart, which is based on information in Opus Agriculturae by Palladius, which is from around 480, and he talks about the length of the shadow cast by a pole about 5 foot high. It's 5 feet high, that would be better. And so you can see that in January, if you look at the length of the shadow for January, you can see that the length at the first hour and the 11th hour is the same. Then the 2nd and the 10th is the same, the 3rd and the 9th, the 4th and the 8th, the 5th and the 7th. And then when you get to the 6th hour, it's the shortest shadow of all, and it's not paired with anything else. So that is obviously midday. So if we had to number off, we had to mark these hours, we would put, I think, prima hora, undecima hora.
I agree.
Segunda hora, decima hora. Tertia, nona. Quarta, octava, quinta, septima,
Sexta.
Right. So we're always talking about these lines when we're giving the time in Roman hours, and that's what the Romans did. Before I test you on whether you can tell the time in Latin, Luke, what would you call this one right up at the top edge here?
Well, if this is undecima, that would have to be duodecima, except
right.
Except
the
that's
Romans
sunset.
Hardly ever mention that. Certainly not in prose. And instead of calling it duodecima hora, what would they normally call it?
Solis occasus.
Right, and that's just the normal way of referring to that one. Okay? So now, are you ready for your big test?
Oh, I'm ready.
Are you capable of telling time without wearing your Legionnaire's armor?
I may be. Let's see what happens.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you these passages. Now they're going to be all in English except for the hour, which is going to be in Latin.
Okay, cool.
All right, here we go. First one from Ad Notationes Super Lucanum. Syene is a region of Egypt in which sexta hora people cast no shadow. Where's that?
At sexta hora, at midday.
Titus Livius, that's his official name.
That is.
Nona diei hora, I reached Corcyra with all my ships. That's Aemilius talking. Nona diei hora, I reached Corcyra with all my ships. Point to that.
Okay. Sexta, septima, octava, nona.
Very nice. Okay, now that was the typical ablative of a numbered hour, and that's the most common way for the Romans to give the hour. But now we're going to make it a little more complicated. Are you ready?
Ready.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay. Titus Livius. In the daytime, inter horam tertiam ferme et quartam, darkness covered everything.
Okay.
So, inter horam tertiam ferme et quartam.
1, 2, 3, and 4 between these two.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a full solar eclipse in the year 188
Ooh,
BC.
cool.
Marcus Aurelius, epistola ad frontonem, ab hora quarta et dimidia, till now I have been writing.
Quarta, 1, 2, 3, 4. Quarta di media.
Dimidia. Can you point a little more slowly? There you go. Quarta hora et dimidia. Very nice. Okay, now, two more. And I think these are what we would call approximations, and you're the Latinist, you will confirm this for me. Okay. Titus Livius. Hora circiter nona. A mule broke loose from the men in charge of it and escaped to the opposite bank of the river. So that's hora circiter nona.
Okay. Sexta, septima, octava, nona. So about here.
About, what do you mean, about?
Circiter means approximately.
Yeah.
So around.
Could it be a little bit on this side of the line?
Sure.
A little bit on the other side
Absolutely.
of the line? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then one more. Asconius, analyzing Cicero's Pro Milone. When the court session was adjourned, circa horam decimam, Titus Munatius exhorted the people in a public meeting. So, circa horam decimam.
Decimam. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So around there, before or after.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's exactly what they do mean. And you can see that the Romans are always giving the time by referring to one of those lines.
Which is exactly what we do, even about 10 o'clock.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, how similar is this Roman way of telling the time to what we do?
That's exactly what we do, except for two differences. One is that it's about a 6-hour difference, depending if you're AM or PM, just as far as the numbers. And that they're the seasonal hours. Otherwise, it's basically the same.
Right. And so what I call, since we're always referring to one of the borderlines on this sundial, I call this borderline mode for telling the time. That's what the Romans used, and that's what we use as well. Okay, now that we've gotten sorted out how the Romans told the time, we're going to deal with how the Greeks did it. And to start off with, we're going to do it the wrong way. That is to say, we're going to assume that the Greeks did it the same way as the Romans did, in borderline mode. And so, I'm going to give some times to Luke, and he's going to point to them on that sundial. But keep in mind, he's getting them wrong intentionally, okay? I know him quite well, and he's quite a bit more clever than he looks. So don't count this against him. Okay, so just like before, I'm going to give you the little passage in English, except for the hour being in Greek. You point to where you think this is, okay? Gospel of John, where Christ remotely heals the son of the royal official. The fever left him yesterday, horan hebdomen.
Okay, hebdomen. It's the 7th hour. Hora hebdomen. This is the 6th, so that's the 7th.
Epitatete grame. On this line.
Yes.
Okay, another one. Let's do something pagan. You ready?
Okay, ready.
Plutarch, Life of Crassus. O king, you begin to build dodecates horas.
The 12th hour.
Where's that?
Yeah, we talked about that before. That would have to be the top, because that's the 11th. The top of the right side of it is the.
Can you see any possible problem with that?
Well, the sun is already set, so that is a problem.
Right. And what did we see with the Romans about the 12th hour?
They would just call it sunset. Solis occasus.
Right. And here, now the authoritative translation of this passage into English was done by the poet John Dryden, of all people, and he wrote, "Your Majesty begins to build at the 12th hour," which would presumably be right there.
Right.
Now, we're going to have to revisit this one. Here, you're going to be talking about, you're going to show us the timing of perhaps the most important event in the history of the world. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
And you better not mess this up, not just because it's the most important event in the history of humankind, but also because the time phrase that you're going to be explaining is the most common in Greek texts from antiquity. So it's worth knowing exactly what this means. Are you ready?
Ready.
Gospel of Matthew. Περί de ten enate in horan, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, περί de ten enaten hora.
Okay.
Where's that?
All right. Around the 9th hour. 6, 7, 8, 9. So around the 9th hour.
More or less.
More or less.
An approximation.
An approximation.
Okay. Now, that is exactly how a translator in the 3rd century made the first translation of this passage into Latin. And it's called the Vetus Latina. And that translator said exactly the same thing. Circa horam nonam. And all of our modern Bible translations in every language agree with that. And so in English, you get either about the 9th hour, or when they translate that into more modern terms, what would that be?
Around?
Yeah, so...
around 3 p.m. About 3 p.m.
Right, because that's the 9th hour would be, in our modern counting, that would be 3 p.m. And that's why Christians around the world, they commemorate the death of Christ at 3 in the afternoon on Good Friday. And in Catholic countries like Italy and Spain, 3 o'clock in the afternoon is the most important point in the Good Friday liturgy.
Right.
Now, can you see any problem with this?
Well,
I mean, the Gospel of Matthew was always considered to be written under divine inspiration. I'm going to show you here a famous painting by Caravaggio where an angel is literally guiding the hand of Matthew as he writes his Gospel, right? And so presumably God and his angels knew the exact time when Christ died. And what's more, we actually have a Jewish legal text from around 100 AD where a certain Rabbi Levi says that whereas Moses told the Israelites that God would be passing over Egypt in that night, nothing more specific, when push came to shove, God smote all the firstborn of Egypt at exactly midnight. Not a hair's breadth before and not a hair's breadth after, because God is as if sitting on a sundial and sees the time exactly, right? So God's timing is exact, whereas human timing is more vague. And then for the death of Christ, the most important event in the history of humankind, we're supposed to think that Matthew couldn't do any better than give us an approximation.
Yeah, that's a little bit difficult.
All right, so that's why we're going to have to come back to this. Now,
Okay.
as I have discovered, this is not the way the Greeks talked about the hours. In order to show you how they did talk about them, we're going to have to make a trip to Egypt.
To Egypt?
Yeah, or at least upstairs where we can see bits of Egypt. Okay? All right, let's go.
This is pretty spectacular. This is the Nilotic Mosaic, the mosaic of the Nile. The orientation here is upside down, the way we normally think of maps. South is at the top, the mountains of the moon coming down, emptying in the Mediterranean down here. That would be where Alexandria is. This is in Opus Vermiculatum. And it's tiny, tiny little tesserae, tiny, tiny little pieces. You can see all the people, of course, partying along the Nile, the animals, both real and fantastical.
So what time of the year is this in Egypt?
Oh, is this the flood?
This is the flood.
Ah.
And so the flood was a special time of the year in Egypt because you couldn't do any farming work, right? Because your land was flooded. And so you hunted or you fished or you partied. And so that's what we see people doing here. And why do they think this one might have been at Praeneste?
Oh, right. Well, this is likely a copy of one that was in Alexandria. And, the goddess Isis, who is associated with the Nile, is also associated with the goddess Fortuna in the Roman pantheon.
What do you make of these animals?
Yeah, we got a rhinoceros, so I guess it's a rhinoceros.
Yeah,
Rhinoceros. Yeah. The hyena.
Yeah, so female lion.
Yeah, lion.
Crocodilo pardalis.
Artos, the bear. Yeah, incredible. So, why did we come to Egypt?
Yeah, well, I wanted you guys to see Egypt in general, but also Alexandria down here. Now, this is related to Greek hours because it was actually the Egyptians who first divided the day into 12 parts. And here you can see what we think is the earliest sundial that's ever been found, from about the year 1500 BC, found in the Valley of the Kings. And so it was the Egyptians who first divided the day into 12 parts, and then when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians, the Greeks who settled in Egypt, they took that Egyptian way of dividing the day into 12 hours and started numbering those hours. And so it's the first numbered hour that is ever mentioned is actually from an Alexandrian. And here we see Alexandria with one of its harbors, I guess. And it's not a surprise that the first numbered hours come from Alexandria, because Alexandria was for 500 years, maybe even longer, the intellectual and cultural capital of the entire Mediterranean. So this first numbered hour that we have is from an astronomer named Timocharis, Greek name, of course, and it's ὥρά legouses. So it means as the third hour was ending. And this is something that he wrote down for the year 283 BC for an astronomical phenomenon, and that doesn't fit very well at all with what we saw before about the way the Romans gave the hours. And so now we're going to go back to the sundials and talk more about the specifically Greek way of giving the hour. So here we are back with our friend the Hemipykyon. And let's see if we can figure out these Greek hours. Now, the one that we got from Timocharis of Alexandria in 283 BC was legouses trites horas, but that was a nighttime hour. And just to make everything a little bit clearer, I'm going to give you 3 Alexandrian hours, Greek hours, but daytime hours. Now, you, right now, try to place these on the sundial.
Okay, ready.
So we have archomenes hebdomes horas.
Okay, beginning of the 7th hour. So the 7th hour as its beginning. So...
Now where's the 7th hour?
Well, in the Roman reckoning, right? 6th and 7th, so when the 7th hour is beginning is somewhere after this line. Is that...
Okay, all right, could be. All right, now let's do this one. Plerotheses horas hectes.
Okay.
Plerotheses horas hectes.
So the fulfilling of the 6th hour, right?
Right.
So 6th hour in the Roman reckoning is here, so as the 6th hour is finishing should be around here.
Okay, all right, we'll see. And then I have one more for you. Mesuses dedicates horas.
Okay, so in the middle of the 10th.
Yeah.
So the 6, 7, 8, 9, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th, so the middle of the 10th.
Yeah, something like that. Okay. Right. Now, it was here that I got to in my research where I got super confused. And I wasn't sure about any of this. And then I said to myself, this is only going to be clear if I can see an ancient sundial with the hours marked on it, right? The numbers on it. So I went looking and I found this one, which is now in a museum near Ephesus, and it's from about the 3rd century AD. Now what do we see on this sundial here? We see the Greek letters which they used for their numbers, but where are they placed? They're not on the lines.
They're between the lines.
They're between the lines, right? So the Romans considered the hour to be on the line, but look at what the Greeks do. Okay, now you've got, the only thing that's a little bit tricky here is the D gamma, which they use for a 6, and so that's the one just to the left of center there, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. Now, we're going to pop these Greek hours into these intervals, right? By the magic of computers. That's right. And now, I'm going to read these same hours to you, but in their full context, and you're going to see if you can place them right correctly now. Okay,
got it.
So the first one I'm going to give you is from actually the 3rd book of Maccabees, and it's fantastic because King Ptolemy IV decides he wants to have drunken elephants crush all the Jews of Alexandria. But don't worry, in the end, 2 angels come down and save the Jews. But in that story, we find this little excerpt, okay? Now, remember, you're looking at Greek hours with the numbers between the lines now. You ready? Mesuses de dedicates horas, Schedon, the man in charge of the invitations, seeing all the guests gathered, went over and poked the king, who had somehow fallen asleep. Now, mesuses decates horas. Where's that going to be?
Okay, so 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th hour zone. So mesuses decates would be in there.
In the middle of it.
In the middle of it.
Now, where had you pointed to before?
I pointed there before.
Yeah. Okay, now, I'm going to give you the other two, and they come from Theon of Alexandria, an astronomer. He was actually the father of Hypatia, who is far better known, okay? At the new moon of the month of Thoth, tes mesembrias, at midday, where's that?
Midday is the middle line, right there.
Which is plerothises horas hectes.
Yeah.
Kai archomenes hebdomes.
Right, beginning of, as the 7th is beginning, as the 6th is ending, is mesembrias.
Yeah, so plerothises hectes,
Yeah.
archomenes hebdomes, tes mesembrias. Couldn't get any more clear than that. Now,
Exactly.
let's see what the implications of this are. It looks like the Greeks are only talking about the intervals between the lines. We've seen the beginning of one of those intervals, the middle of one of those intervals, the end of one of those intervals. Now, let's just see if they had a way of talking about the lines at all, right? Because we know the Romans are always talking about the lines and only the lines, okay? So let's take this fourth one here.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, the fourth line, okay? Now, what would that be in Latin?
Hora quarta.
Right, now, we have, from the 11th century, an abbot of a monastery in the north of Syria named Nikon. And we're going to pop in a Byzantine sundial onto the screen here so you can see that the Byzantines continue to put their numbers for their hours between the lines, inside those hour zones, not on the lines, okay? Now let's see. He's got his monks that are hungry in the morning and they need their breakfast. And so he wants them to eat their breakfast right on that line, which would be quarta hora in Latin. Now let's see what it says in Greek. All right, and you point to this. On Saturday, pleroma tetartes horas, archein de pemptein horan, one must set the table and eat 2 portions with olive oil. Now this just blew my mind when I found this because it's clear that he wants his monks to have their breakfast at that point, but he's unable to name that point. The best he can do is name the end of the hour preceding or the beginning of the hour following. And it's clear that that was a convention and they wouldn't meet all together at that time. But here's the thing, if he'd had a way of naming that moment in time, you'd think he would have used it. And if he has to do something as clumsy as saying pleroma tetartes horas archein de pemptein horan, it's because he doesn't have any linguistic means of pointing to that line so that you can see into the Middle Ages. And I think this continued right up to the fall of Constantinople. The Greeks continued to think only in the terms of these hour zones, the intervals between the lines. They never, ever referred to the lines themselves, which is completely different from what the Romans did. Now, since the Greeks are always talking about these hour zones, and in fact they call them horiaia polýMATHY, and never about the lines, I call this Greek way of giving the hours zone mode, because you never refer to the borderlines, you refer to the zones between them only, right? And this way of thinking about the hours of the day, treating them as these zones, corresponded perfectly with another aspect of culture in the Eastern Mediterranean that we have lost all familiarity with.
Really?
Right, yeah, and so we saw the Egyptians up there, and we saw that they are the ones who first divided the day into 12 hours. But each of those 12 parts of the day for the Egyptians corresponded to a sector of the heavens, and was therefore under the influence of the stars and the gods that were in that sector, that corresponding sector of the heavens. And those stars and deities influenced what happened on earth in that particular hour zone. And this is something that in the post-Enlightenment West, we really have no notion of. Now, we saw that it was the Greeks who settled in Egypt, who adopted this 12-part division of the day, but then they took their own deities and decided that it was those deities that governed the hour zones. And so they assigned each of their 7 main deities to 7 hours, to a block of 7 hours, and then they repeated that same block 24 times, and that makes 168 hours, or 1 week. 1 week, exactly. And in addition, the god that governed the first daylight hour of each of the 7 days was the most powerful on that day. And that is why we say Sunday, Monday, Martedì, Mercoledì, Venerdì, and Saturn Day. Right? See what I did there?
Very good.
Right. But it wasn't just that. I mean, every single hour of the week then was influenced by the ruler of the day, but also additional influence from whoever ruled that particular hour. So you had a combination of influences, which meant that each hour of the week was almost unique in its character. And so you had to plan your life according to what was good to do in a given hour, or maybe not do what was bad to do in a given hour. So
It's complicated.
It got pretty complicated. And I'm going to give you a little sample of this from a late antique astronomical manual, because they're the same thing that an ordinary person would have probably used to organize their lives. The second day is ruled by the moon. That's our Monday. She administers the 1st and 8th hours of that day, and they're not useful for work. Kronos administers the 2nd and 9th hour zones, so they're not useful either, but rather harmful. But Zeus has the 3rd and the 10th hour zones. These are good ones, and anyone who leaves on a trip during these hours will return happy. Ares is in charge of the 4th and 11th hour zones, and they're good for social gatherings. The Sun has the 5th and 12th hour zones. These bring joy. Aphrodite has the 6th hour zone, and it's useful for joining with women. Hermes has the 7th hour zone, and this hour means damage or financial punishments or fines. Right?
How seriously did they take all of this?
Well, listen, we have quite a bit of evidence that even in antiquity, people were organizing their activities around this, but the juiciest example, or 2 juicy examples I'm going to give you, are actually from Byzantine times, because they never stopped doing this the whole time in the east of the Mediterranean. Okay? So, for example, in the 12th century, we have the Emperor Manuel recalling the fleet that has just been sent out because his astrologers back in Constantinople realized, they made a mistake with the calculation of the correct hour to send the fleet out. And if the fleet continues, they'll get their butts kicked, right? So the fleet has to come back until they find a better hour for it to be sent out at. So at the highest levels, they were taking this stuff seriously.
No, it's true. I mean, even thinking of, say, the Persians' invasion of Greece, they were going to land at Marathon, and the Spartans wouldn't help because it wasn't the right day religiously.
Right. Now, in those times, 450 years before Christ, they weren't yet so worried about the hours.
Right, not yet, but
Not yet.
still, give an
But-
example of Greece itself is going to collapse under under Persian boots, and they're not going to help because they took it seriously.
Yeah, because it's the wrong day. So by the time of Christ, and then for another 15 centuries afterwards, it was down to the hour. They had to find the right hour for things to happen. So my favorite example is from sports, of course, right? And listen, you're you grew up in Bucks County, is that right?
I did.
Okay, and so you were an Eagles fan.
Oh, I still am.
Okay, all right, so you guys all know, I'm sure everybody knows this, the Philadelphia Eagles lost the Super Bowl 2 years ago to the Kansas City Chiefs, right?
What is the line from the Aeneid? Juno still feels the pain in her
now,
chest.
Whose fault was that?
Oh, it was the ref's fault, obviously.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, all the Eagles fans blame the referees. Now, in Constantinople, in the 10th century, they did not have American football, but what did they have instead? What was the big sport?
They had a chariot race.
Chariot racing. And the Greens had a pretty rough time. It must be the green uniform.
Eagle greens.
Yeah, it's tough, I think, to win when you're wearing a green uniform. All right, so let me read you what happened in the year 1031 or 1032 AD. What are the 4 teams in Constantinople?
The greens, the blues, and the whites,
And the reds.
And the reds.
All right, so in this race, it was the greens should have beaten the whites. But
Right.
let's see what happened here.
Okay.
It was customary for the race to take place in the 7th hour zone, or at the beginning of the 8th, or even to last for the whole of the 8th hour zone. So, customary for the race to take place in this 7th hour zone, maybe the beginning of the 8th, sometimes even to extend itself through the whole 8th hour zone. But on this day, it was extended into the 9th hour zone, and the moon into the 9th. But the moon fell away from the 7th place in the sky into the 6th, the one of misfortune and calamity, and the greens were immediately crushed, since Aphrodite was coming into her culmination at midheaven, and the whites were fully energized. Right?
Maybe that's what happened to the eagles. It wasn't just the wrong end zone, it was the wrong hour zone.
Could have been. So you can see that this was taken seriously at kind of all levels of society for a very, very long time, which seems pretty weird to us, I think.
Well, what about the Jews and the Christians?
Yeah, well, some of them took this Hellenistic astrology and the hours pretty seriously, but they also had their own schemes for assessing the character and the quality of each hour. And for example, we've got what's called an Euthemenon, which is from before 70 AD from Judea. And let's see what it tells us about just a few of these 24 hours of the day. The 6th daytime hour zone is the praise of the cherubim who petition against the iniquity of our human nature. The 7th hour zone, the entry and exit from before God, when the prayers of all that lives enter and worship and depart. The 8th hour zone, the praise of fire and of the waters, blah, blah, blah. The 10th hour zone, visitation of the waters, when the Spirit is descending and brooding over the waters and over the fountains. And in that hour, the waters are taken up, and the priest of God mixes them with consecrated oil and anoints those who are afflicted, and they are restored and healed. So you can see that for Jews and Christians, there were good hours for doing certain things, and then other hours where different angels had influence. All right? So we'll see that. So this was not only pagans, but Christians as well. So now that you, I hope, and everybody else has a little bit better idea of how speakers of Greek treated the hours, let's go back to those excerpts that we saw before and see if you can do them a little bit better this time, right?
Okay.
You did them wrong intentionally before. We'll forgive you if you can get them right this time, okay? So, Gospel of John, where Christ remotely heals the son of the royal official.
Right.
The fever left him yesterday. ὥράν hebdomen. ὥράν hebdomen. Where's that?
Hebdomen, the 7th hour zone, is here.
Right, and that's an hour zone. It's not that line. And we just heard from that Euthemeron that the 7th hour was the one daytime hour where the prayers of the living could enter before God and maybe be answered. So there's no other explanation in the Bible of why the son of the royal official was healed during the 7th hour.
Right.
But I don't think we'd be crazy to make a connection between that Euthemenon and this passage in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, it's not random.
And again, it's in a context where there's no other time given in the whole story. And so it's not connected to anything else within the narrative. And so you look for a connection to something outside the narrative. And that just might be it, right? Okay, now let's do Plutarch's Life of Crassus this time, all right? And I'm going to give you a little more context this time so that it's clear what's happening, all right? So Crassus is in Asia Minor. And having found King Deiotarus of Galatia, a very old man already, but founding a new city, Crassus mocked him, saying, O king, you begin to build dodekates horas. Now, point to that. Where is dodekates horas now?
The sundial's divided into 12 pieces of pie.
Yeah.
And that's the last piece.
So, you're in that last piece. Where in that last piece?
Say it again.
Dodekates horas.
Sometime during that last zone.
Yeah. in that last zone.
Yeah.
Now, do we get the joke now?
Yeah.
Right. Now, if Dryden's translation had been correct, that he begins to build at the 12th hour, the
He'd
king
already
would,
be dead.
he'd be dead already,
Yeah.
right? Which makes no sense. But if he's building that city somewhere within that last hour zone, he has at least a little bit of his lifetime left to finish it. And so now it's funny, right? And so, I guess, thanks a lot, John Dryden, for ruining the fantastic ancient Greek joke.
Dryden.
So we've got within the 7th hour zone for the Gospel of John. We got within the 12th hour zone for Crassus's fantastic joke. Okay. Now, we still have 2 problems to clear up before we have a complete understanding of Greek hours. Now, one of these problems is a practical one. Okay, so Luke, I want you to imagine for once that you're a practical man. Okay? And so let's say that you're an ancient Alexandrian, a super practical one, and you want to meet, I don't know, another philologist at the library in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, you know how Greek hours work. How are you going to set an appointment with your philologist friend at the library?
Best I could do would be the example of the that dupika, where you're finishing 1 hour and starting another.
Nice. Now, if you just give an hour, any old hour, that indicates a zone, which at Alexandria was 50 modern minutes long in the winter and 70 modern minutes long in the summer. So you have to do better than that, okay?
Yeah.
Now, you talked about the abbot, so he talked about the end of an hour or the beginning of an hour. Which would be better for making an appointment?
At the beginning.
Why?
Because of the importance that certain deities and the angels might have over certain hours.
Right. Now, what happens if you set an appointment at the end of an hour? I don't know, you want the goddess of learning, probably, I don't know, is that Athena, to bless your meeting with this other philologist, and so you know which hour she will help you out at.
Right.
Would you set an appointment with your fellow philologist for the end of that hour?
No, it'd be at the beginning, so to make sure that she rules that whole hour.
Right, and if you set that appointment at the end and your buddy turns up late, boom, you're in somebody else's hour already, and you don't get the cosmological connection that you wanted, right?
Correct.
So you will agree that it's more convenient and logical to set appointments at the beginning of an hour.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's see if we can find some of these in Greek texts. Now, I searched long and hard, and here's a very obvious one from Constantinople. And we will come back to ancient times. All right? May it not be permitted for tavern keepers on great feasts and on Sundays to even partially open their premises and sell anyone wine or food. Mechris arches defteras horas tes hemeras. Mechris.
It's the beginning of the Deuteras, the second hour.
Yeah. So you can't sell anybody wine or food until the beginning of the second hour of the day. Super logical.
Yeah.
Okay, now, we know that people were being practical and using these times for scheduling, the beginnings of hour for schedulings, because of this fantastic text written by Egeria or Syriac. Now, she was a noblewoman from Gaul or maybe Galicia who visited the Holy Land in the late 4th century. Right? And she described in minute detail everything that she saw there, but writing in Latin. And she was at the liturgy for Palm Sunday in Jerusalem, and here's what she told us about the timings of the events on Palm Sunday. Then each person goes home and hurries to eat, so that everybody might be ready. Hora incoante septima, in the church, which is in Eleona, the Mount of Olives, where the cave in which the Lord taught is located. What does that mean? Incoante hora septima.
As the 7th hour is beginning.
Right. Okay. Now here's another one. Et cum ceperit se facere hora nona, everybody goes up with hymns to Imbomon, where the Lord ascended into heaven. What does that mean? Et cum ceperit se facere hora nona.
As it began to be the 9th hour.
Beginning of the 9th hour. Etiam cum coeperit esse hora undecima. The passage from the Gospel is read in which children with branches and palms run up to the Lord saying, Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini. cum coeperit esse hora undecima.
As it began to be the 11th hour.
Right. So you can see that they scheduled a series of events in Jerusalem at the beginnings of the hours. And we know that they spoke Greek in Jerusalem, and Egeria says herself explicitly that the language of the liturgy there was Greek. So she's translating into Latin the timings of those events in Greek. And she's talking about the beginnings of the hours.
Wow.
Now that's super logical that you would use the beginnings of hours for scheduling events, and yet we don't find a lot of archomenes tes horas or arche tes horas in ancient texts. We find them more in Byzantine texts, but we know the ancients were doing this as well. So that brings us to our second problem, and we have to go back now to that set phrase that we said was the most common for Greek writers when they talked about numbered hours. Which one was it?
Περί ταύτην ὥράν.
Yeah, all right. And we saw the passage from the Gospel of Matthew where Christ dies, περί ταύτην ὥράν. And that's always been translated as kirka horam nonam, treated as an approximation. But okay, if we now know that the Greeks, when they talked about numbered hours, were talking about these zones or polýMATHY and never about the lines, does that make any sense? I mean, what sense does it make to say περί this zone? I mean, show me where that is.
Yeah, around the zone, that's the whole zone, so there's already a genitive version of that.
Right, and again, if it were a little bit after the zone, you would think they would just name the following hour. If it was a little before the zone, you'd think they'd name the preceding hour. So it doesn't make a lot of sense if the hours are zones, all right? So we got to take a step back here. I mean, it looks like this word περί, in this particular phrase, when it's περί ταύτην ὥράν, cannot possibly mean around or about, right? Because we just don't talk that way about intervals. So let's see if we can figure out what else it might mean. Now, if we back up from the ancient Greek περί and go back to the Proto-Indo-European that it comes from, which apparently is per, we see that the primary meanings of per were towards or through. Does that sound familiar?
Absolutely, just like Latin.
So per in Latin means?
Through, primarily.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Now, in Proto-Indo-European, the word per had some extended meanings, which, aside from around, were also near and against. So let's see if we can find any ancient Greek phrases where περί means against. And for that, we're going to go back up to Egypt. Here we are again, in front of our favorite Strouton, and we need a boat, and I think this is the boat that we're going to talk about. And what do you think is going on? What's that boat doing?
Well, I don't know. They see a hippo there, so I bet it... Are they doing hippo hunting?
I think they're hippo hunting, and I'm not very enthusiastic about hippo hunting.
Me neither.
I don't think anybody should go hunting hippos, whether you're Egyptian or Greek or whatever. So I think what we need to do is we need to destroy the hippo hunting boat. Would that be okay? That's okay with everybody? Fantastic.
Absolutely.
All right, so
save the hippos.
Let's make a big old storm come up here on the Nile Delta, and it's going to drive the hippo hunting boat against this land, which is right behind it, against this shore.
Okay.
Now let's say that happens, and you get a big old shipwreck, and then one of the hippo hunters somehow survives, and he ends up on that shore. How would we describe that in English? We would say that this hippo hunter was shipwrecked
on the shore.
On the shore. And if it were maybe even a little more violent,
thrown against the shore.
Thrown against the shore. Okay. Yeah. Now, would you ever, in English, say anything like, the shipwrecked person was hurled around the shore?
No.
No, and I don't think so either. I don't think that would make much sense. But now, let's see how they describe this in Greek. Are you ready? And the shipwrecked person now is going to be John of Patmos, who supposedly wrote the book of Revelations. For in this city of Ephesus, he spent his time after being shipwrecked, περί τον αγγελών, having been cast out of the sea, still living. So, Luke.
Περί τον αγγελών.
Περί ton agelon. Now, if you get shipwrecked, περὶ ton agelon, what does the περί mean in that phrase?
Well, it can't mean around. It has to mean against.
Onto, against, something like that. So we see that in Greek, as spoken in Koine, περί can mean against. And now, let's go back down to the sundial and see how that affects the way they talked about the time.
All right.
So we saw our shipwreck. We saw the poor guy thrown. περί ton agelon. Now let's see if that helps us understand what's going on with this time phrase. Let's say that we're being shipwrecked onto that 9th hour. Now, this gnomon would move towards that 9th hour zone. And then as we hit that 9th hour zone, could that possibly be just like the beach upstairs? Could the beginning of that 9th hour zone be what is meant in this expression, περὶ ταύτην ὥράν? What do you think?
Given that it's the most frequent time expression that's used all throughout ancient Greek literature, that's the time expression you want to use to give a precise time, immediate time. So,
Right.
yeah.
So, but if we're right, Luke, what does that mean about all the translations of Matthew?
It means it's not around the 9th hour.
Right.
It's
Right. So we're saying, point to that, περὶ ταύτην ὥράν, if we're right.
right here.
Yeah, at the beginning of that 9th
Yeah.
hour zone. Whereas all the translations place that event over here at this line.
An hour late.
So how do you feel being one of two people in the world who thinks that Christ died here, whereas everybody else for 1700 years has thought that Christ died here?
Wow, that's special.
I feel okay?
Yeah, that's
Do you
crazy.
need a little bit of support?
I would like some support.
Okay, do you want moral support or textual support for this?
I'm gonna go with textual support.
I can get you some textual support, as it just so happens, right? So we have a actually should be better known theologian and philosopher from 6th century Alexandria named Ioannes or Philoponos. So John Philoponos is what he's called. And he did like every other theologian at the time. He was trying to figure out exactly when Christ was born. But in so doing, he casually leaves us this little tidbit about when Christ died. So here's the quote from John Philoponos. But the death of the Lord occurred περὶ ταύτην ὥράν toutesti ogdoes annuomenes, when there was still darkness. So you show me ogdoes annuomenes.
7th zone, 8th zone, that's when the 8th zone is ending.
Ending. Now show me as precisely as you can ogdoes annuomenes, right? And that, for John Philoponos, was also περὶ ταύτην.
Right.
So you can see that he's definitely treating περὶ ταύτην ὥράν as the beginning of that, right after ogdoes annuomenes.
Right.
Now, if that's the time that Christ died, so right at the beginning of that 9th hour zone, what kind of time has the angel given Matthew for the most important event in human history?
A very precise time.
Yeah, it's an exact time, which theologically makes a lot more sense.
So, are you telling me, Adrian, that every translation of the original Greek Gospels is wrong?
For this particular passage, for the death of Christ, all but one.
Really?
Yeah, there was one person who got this right. It was the person who translated into Syriac in the 5th century into the version which is called the Peshitta today. And that person translated this περὶ ταύτην ὥράν as towards the face of 9 hours cried out Yeshu. And I always joke about this. It wasn't towards the backside of 9 hours or the midsection of 9 hours. It was towards the face of 9 hours, which presumably is the beginning of the 9th hour zone. Right? But aside from that one person, every single one of the other translations, whether medieval, early modern, or modern, have gotten this wrong. But the one that I blame is the bad translation into Latin. That was done by somebody that we don't even know about.
Yeah, the Vetus Latina.
The Vetus Latinos. And then Jerome, who had spent lots of time in the East before he was called upon to edit these Gospels, somehow let that mistake stand. And that's where we are today. Everybody thinking that Christ died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when in fact it was, what would we call that in modern hours?
2 p.m.
Or really just after.
Just after 2 p.m.
2 p.m., right?
Yeah.
And I think what makes Jerome look even a little bit worse is the fact that Egeria, when she went to Jerusalem, she wasn't just there for the liturgy on Palm Sunday. She stayed the whole week and she participated in the liturgy on Golgotha, on Good Friday in the afternoon, and she gives us precise information about what happened there. And let me read that to you. And so from the 6th hour to the 9th, there are always lessons being read or hymns being said. There is nobody old or young who does not weep on that day for those 3 hours over the fact that the Lord suffered such things for us. After this, cum coeperit se jam hora nona facera. The passage from the Gospel of John is read where he gives up the ghost. What did you hear there? Cum coeperit se jam hora nona facera.
When the 9th hour was beginning.
Where's that?
That's right here.
So she agrees with, who does she agree with?
With the original Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
John Philoponus.
Yeah.
And with us. How about that?
Good old Egeria.
All right. And now, for all you biblical scholars out there thinking that this is impossible, that Christ died just after 2 p.m. because he died after 3 hours of darkness and the darkness began at noon. Well, in the Greek, the darkness began apo hektes horas, which is this hour zone. And very often, that set phrase, apo tavtestes horas, means from the beginning of that hour zone. So the darkness actually started just after 11 a.m. in our reckoning.
So how long did this Greek system continue of reckoning the hours?
Well, I mean, up until the fall of Constantinople, if the territory was still under the control of the Byzantine Empire. If you were in that empire, this is the way you told the time. And so we see in Byzantine times even more mentions with participles about archomenestes horas or archetes horas, more mentions of the middles and even more mentions of the end. And they kept doing this right up to the end.
Wow, incredible. And what about the περὶ τεν ὥράν?
Yeah, my favorite phrase. Well, this one was used pretty frequently, and you find it in monastic typica, which are detailed schedules of everything the monks had to do in a monastery. And then, at about the year 1000, you start to see the phrase arche tavtetes horas appear in competition with it. And they're both used for about 100 years, and then from about the year 1100, the περί ταύτην horas drops out of use, and you only find the arche ekinestes horas. So it would appear that it dropped out of common use around the year 1000. But in Chronicles, it continues to be used because Chronicles were written in an archaic style, and often they were continuations of previous authors' works. And so this phrase continues to appear in Chronicles, and after I had written all of this up and understood all of this, just by dumb luck, I ran into a chronicle written in the 14th century by a guy named Nikephoros Gregoras. And he was exceptional because he wasn't just a chronicler, he was also an astronomer. And he's actually reasonably famous because he is the first person that we know of to ever predict a full solar eclipse. So he saw a full solar eclipse coming for the 16th of July, 1330, and wrote an entire booklet showing his mathematical calculations that allowed him to know that this eclipse was coming. And then the day, the 16th of July, 1330, arrived, and there was an eclipse but an hour later than he anticipated, right? So he went back and he found the error in his calculations, And we still have that manuscript to this day. So we can see where he made his mistake and where he corrected himself. And then years later, he wrote a chronicle about these years. And when he got to the year 1330, he said, yeah, there was a full solar eclipse. And as it turned out, it was at περὶ δωδεκάται ὥράν, which I think should be at the beginning of that last hour zone of the day.
It would have to be, otherwise it's sunset.
Right, now if it were a Roman hour, then it would be sunset, it would make no sense.
Yeah.
So after reading this, I thought to myself, hey, that's pretty cool that they kept using this phrase for so long. And it wasn't until about a week later when I thought, wait a second, it's a full solar eclipse. If we know the place, Constantinople, and the year, 1330, and the date, July 16th, we should be able to go back and find out exactly when that full solar eclipse occurred. And so we can retrospectively see exactly what Nikephoros Grigoras meant, right? So I called up Michal, you know him, he is a much better scientist than me, and I said, can we find out? He said, yeah, we'll just put this in Stellarium, which is an online planetarium, and he set this up for the 16th of July, 1330, right? And we watched the sun descend through the late afternoon sky, and I have to admit I was a bit nervous about this because this was going to reveal whether I understood this phrase correctly or not. And puff, there was a solar eclipse, and it was 17 minutes into that last seasonal hour, which lasted for 73 minutes on that summer day. So 17 minutes into a 73-minute long hour, less than a quarter of the way in. And I think that given the resolution of these sundials, particularly as you got up towards the edge of them, I think that would have been considered the beginning of that 12th seasonal hour. So I cannot imagine any more objective proof of what this phrase means.
Wow. So how is it the ancient Romans ended up having a different way of telling time?
Listen, that's a tough question to answer, and I can only speculate. But if I had to guess, I would recall to your memory the story of how the Romans started telling time in the first place. And that is that in the First Punic War, they captured the city of Catania in Sicily, and they looted the entire city, and in amongst that booty that they took back to Rome was the sundial that had been in the Agora in Catania. And they just took that back to Rome, and they plunked that down in the Forum, and that became the sundial at Rome. And it took them 4 generations to realize that it wasn't calibrated for Rome. It was calibrated for a place that was 4 degrees of latitude further to the south. So it wasn't working. It wasn't telling them the right time. It took them 100 years nearly to even realize that. So I don't think that when they started telling time, they really knew what the Greeks were doing. And if I had to guess, I would say they stole this sundial, plunked it down in Rome, and some guy saw the lines on there, and of course they weren't labeled, because normally they aren't, and this Roman just decided that, oh, the lines are the hours, and that's the way they started talking, and it just went from there. And to this day, we talk like that first Roman who misunderstood what the Greeks were doing. That's my best guess.
Incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Well, how important is this then?
Now listen, I think there's 2 aspects we can separate this into. There's the qualitative difference. Now, if I'm right, and I am, in every single one of our translations from Greek texts, the translator has just given the wrong time qualitatively. And that often is nearly an hour wrong. But to me, that's not, and listen, it's important. If we want to translate texts at all or read ancient texts, we might as well understand what they're really saying. But more than that quantitative difference, I think, it's the qualitative difference which is more important. Because in the Eastern Mediterranean, their hour zones always had a cosmological aspect to them. And that's something that the Roman way of telling time doesn't have at all. And so if we translate these, if we understand these Greek hours better, and we translate them better, we communicate more of their feeling for the way different hours of the day had different characters and were connected to other parts of the cosmos in a way that Roman times never were.
Yeah, that's true. And that's exactly the same kind of thing that we feel as speakers of ancient Greek, as speakers of Latin. When we speak the languages, we could just take Italian or we could take modern Greek and keep the same syntax, just put in the ancient word here and there, and we have, okay, I guess it's kind of Latin or ancient Greek, not really. But what we like to do is to find those ancient idioms, like you did so beautifully in Pharos, and show us how we can actually express the real terms and the real ways of using these languages. And something that inevitably we come into then is, how do these ancient cultures actually interact with the world? How do they count time? How do they count the dates? How do they...
And this Greek way of talking about short time, which is these hour zones, is completely different from the way we do it in the post-Enlightenment West, at least.
Wow. So for those of us who speak ancient Greek or aspire to speak ancient Greek better, how should we go about telling time? Should we just use the Greek words for the numbers of our 24-hour system the way we normally use it?
When I do it, I talk about the hour zones. I do it exactly as the ancient Greeks did, and they were able to set appointments, as we saw. They could do everything that was needed for daily life within their system. And I think that helps us then see what might be intended when we find them talking about an hour in one of their texts.
Wow. So, okay, if it's 1 p.m., how would we say that in ancient Greek?
Well, for a Greek, that doesn't exist. They would probably say the beginning of the 8th hour after sunrise. So that would be περὶ ὥράν. And that would get you just after 1 p.m., so pretty close.
περὶ ὥράν.
Yeah.
How did this information get lost?
That's another tough question, but I think it's worth talking about that a little bit. It shouldn't have been left to me, who has no formal training in ancient Greek or biblical studies whatsoever at any university or seminary, to figure this out. And the fact that I had to figure this out means that something's going on in those fields. And if I had to divide the people that deal with Koine Greek, not just from antiquity, but as was used by the Byzantines in their writing almost right up to the fall of Constantinople, I would say that there are people who approach it from modern Greek, and I think that those people sometimes grossly overestimate the continuity between Koine and their modern Greek, and so they don't see what's happening in those texts sometimes. And I think in Western Europe and in North America, most people who get to ancient Greek get to it having done Latin first, and then they very often read the Greek through the lens of Latin, so to speak. And as we saw today, that can be a real handicap. And then biblical scholars in North America who aren't fighting preconceptions from modern Greek or from Latin, that is even harder to explain. I guess it might be because perhaps they don't read very widely around the New Testament, and I'd have never figured this stuff out if I hadn't read a lot of pagan texts, particularly the astronomical or astrological one, because they were the same thing in antiquity. And I get the feeling that biblical scholars have a pretty strong allergy to that kind of stuff. So, and you know, as far as looking back on this, retrospectively, I think some of these things should have set some alarm bells ringing. I mean, for people to have believed for 1,700 years that Matthew would give us an approximation for the time of Christ's death, to me, in retrospect, that's a little bit ridiculous. And then the text by Egeria in Latin is very well known. Very well known. And anybody who's got a good grounding in Latin and reads that text should look at the way she tells about the time and say, whoa, there's something funny going on here. There's some questions that need to be posed here. So, listen, if we can take something positive from this, you're the positive one. What would you take? What positive would you take from all of this?
Well, now we can finally connect back. We can finally appreciate these times as they're described in antiquity, the qualitative as well as the quantitative.
Yeah. And I mean, what I would say is, this is a discovery that took quite a few centuries to be made, if it's a discovery. And there's probably other stuff out there. There's probably other things that we are completely misunderstanding that are yet to be found. So we still have a lot of work to do and a lot of really interesting things to learn.
Yeah, as ancient as it is, this is a field of fresh research for all of us. Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for coming here and telling us all about this. This was fantastic.
Yeah, hey, thanks for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and I've really enjoyed being here with you today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, it's lunchtime.